Beginning from the 12th century, you have another important player which enters the politics of this region, and that is the advent of Islam. Now, in the 11th century, the first Islamic invaders reached the shores of Sindh, which is the westernmost frontier of our country, and new empires are established. The Delhi Sultanate is established, for instance. And with the coming of the Muslims, Sufi thought enters the Indian subcontinent. And Sufi thought presents an entirely new domain of thinking, of seeing yourself in light, in terms of God. And the resultant factor, because of this interaction, is the Sant tradition. Now, before we come on to the Sant tradition, there are a few things that I wanted to show. These are some important monuments that were built in this first millennium Common Era, that is 1000 to 1100 BCE. This is the famous Shiva of the Elephanta caves, built under the patronage of the Rashtrakutas. This is the famous Lingam of Shiva at the Brihadishwara temple at Thanjavur, built under the patronage of the Cholas in the 11th century. You had bronzes of Shiva, Vishnu. You can see here an image of Narasimha, the man-lion form of Vishnu. So these temples were being built increasingly in these centuries, in the 10th, 11th centuries. Then you had the rise of an empire known as the Vijayanagar Empire in the south, which again took temple building to an altogether different level. What is important to remember is that these temples are dedicated to Puranic gods like Vishnu, Shiva and Devi. So the Sant tradition in India is basically the consequence of this religious interaction that takes place with these foreign people, with these new people who are entering the subcontinent. Okay? In the northern frontiers, you have people like Nanak and Kabir who call for a total abandonment of any tangible idea of God. They say that the idea of God is so abstract and so profound that you can really never give him a form. So therefore they propound what is known as Nirguna Bhakti. You have Saguna Bhakti also in North India. This is like a dividing line between them. These are the Nirguna poets like Ravi Das and Guru Nanak and Kabir who focus on the formlessness of God. They say you can really not describe him in terms of attributes, which makes their religion more accessible. And on the other hand, you have a lot of Saguna Bhakti poets in North India. For example, Mirabai, who gives him the tangible form of the flute playing Krishna. You have a person known as Surdas, who cannot see, but he composes padas in praise of the child Krishna. You have a person by the name of Chaitanya in Bengal, who lays a lot of emphasis in the name of God, Hari Nama. Chaitanya goes out on the streets of Bengal chanting the name of Hari and says that it is only by chanting the name of Hari, by chanting the name of Krishna, by chanting the name of Rama that you can be saved in this age of Kali. Okay? And at the same time, all of these poets are interacting with you. And if you read the stories of poets like Chaitanya, you have a lot of Muslim individuals who have some role to play in their lives. Which shows that cultural interaction is taking place. Nanak, for example, is born into a Khatri family, which is essentially Hindu in the western frontier, but he is also interacting with a lot of Sufi poets in the region, because Punjab becomes this region of cultural genesis. You have Sufis and you have thinkers from all over from Central Asia. You have Sufi thinkers, you have mystics from the Nath tradition in North India, who are all coming together in Punjab. And Nanak is born in a region where these cultural interactions are taking place. That is why if you look at Sikh scripture, even now, the Guru Granth Sahib does not contain just the songs of the 10 Sikh Gurus. It also contains the verses of people like Kabir Das and say Rahim, or even Hindu saints like Namdev and Tukaram. Not Tukaram, sorry, Namdev's hymns, you'll find it in the Guru Granth Sahib. Because this is a different kind of cultural interaction that takes place, which was never seen before. In the time of the Guptas, yes, there were people who were coming from abroad, but at a scale when it was happening in the early century Common Era, it is again seen in this period. We have now reached the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries Common Era, when a new form of religious interaction is taking place because of the advent of Islam. As you move to the 17th century, 16th and 17th centuries, in peninsular India, Bhakti acquires a very different form. I told you initially that cults were initially centered only around Vishnu and Shiva. But in Karnataka and Maharashtra now, they widen their base even more. For example, the Varkari tradition of Maharashtra, which lays a lot of emphasis on the equality of all. There is no differentiation between man or woman, between high caste or low caste. Everyone goes to the temple of Vitthal and prays. Okay, at the shrine of Vitthal in Pandharpur, everyone is allowed to get into the sanctum, touch the feet of the deity and worship him on his own. Because they don't believe in class and caste-based distinctions. Similarly, you have people like Basaveshwara and Akka Mahadevi in Karnataka, who are pioneers of the Lingayat tradition. The Lingayat tradition breaks away all caste boundaries. Says that, the tattva in every one of us is that of Shiva. And they carry a Shivalinga with them at all times. You see, Basaveshwara is wearing a small locket which essentially contains a small linga inside. So you have radical ideas now happening. See, until now, the idea of caste, the idea of purity and pollution were never really addressed in any of the movements that preceded. But with the coming of poets in North India like Nanak, Kabir, and people like Tukaram, Namdev, Purandaradasa, Basaveshwara, Akka Mahadevi in peninsular India, caste-based distinctions are critiqued for the first time. Now you are in the 16th, 17th centuries. They do not place any importance on spiritual merit. They are like, it is your effort. Your birth will not endow you with any kind of spiritual merit. It is again, you have to work hard towards it. You have to engage yourself with the chosen deity. You have to engage in bhakti. It is only then that salvation will come to you. Salvation is not a package that is meant for the privileged few. That is why all of these bhakti movements in this time, they lay a lot of emphasis on egalitarianism. A thing which was not seen before. So caste-based distinctions are questioned. Gender-based distinctions are questioned. Akka Mahadevi used to roam around naked. The only things covering her body used to be those hair, those flowing hair. And she was seen with, a lot of reverence and respect wherever she went. Because in the Lingayat tradition, Akka Mahadevi's body is no longer seen as, a symbol of attachment or lust. It is accorded a greater sanctity. So, at the turn of the 17th century, you have radical ideas that are taking. So you see, though I won't be able to do justice to the amount of, to the actual extent of change that was taking place, because for us living in the 21st century, these are very normal things, egalitarianism and not believing in caste-based distinctions, because we have struggled through these ideas across civilizations, and at this point, in the 16th and 17th centuries, these ideas are criticized for the first time. And beginning with the 18th century, you have the second most important player in the history of Hinduism, in the history of India, which comes in, which is the British. The British arrive in our country in the year 1600, and as I said initially in my presentation, they want to know more about the people of the Indian subcontinent. They want to know more about our traditions, our practices. So that because they feel that knowing these practices would help them govern us better. So therefore they engage in a lot of translations. You see this image over here is that of a man called Sir William Jones, who established the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1973. Sir William Jones was also the person who deciphered the Brahmi script. And when he deciphered the Brahmi script, we came to know about the Mauryan Empire. Had it not been for him, the Mauryas would have been some obscure part of history. So they engage in a lot of translation projects. You have people like Max Muller, who arrive in India, who translate the Rig Veda Samhita into Western languages. So for the first time, the doors of India open to the West. The wisdom from here goes to the West. And a very different narrative of Hinduism begins. So from here, the term Hinduism comes to be attached to this tradition. They try to understand Hindu, they try to understand Indic rites, Indian customs and traditions and ideas in a very Western frame of work. Okay, so this is problematic at several levels. That this gives rise to the whole Orientalist discourse, for instance, and that has been criticized by a lot of scholars now. Orientalism in itself is a deeply problematic way of looking at things. But for the first time, these cross-cultural interactions begin taking place between Europe and India. You have certain paintings over here which were made by European observers in the Indian subcontinent. And as Western ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity enter the Indian subcontinent, You have reform movements that emerge. You have people like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Okay, so it's not that, established Hindu practices have not been questioned before, but they are being dealt with at an even greater intensity now. People like Ram Mohan Roy are campaigning for the marriage of widows. People like Vidyasagar want women, people like Vidyasagar and Savitribai Phule want women to step out of the house and, work and to, to not be dependent on male members alone. So at a social front, the ideas of liberty and equality, they have an influence on all of these Indian thinkers. People like Ram Mohan Roy, they were extensively trained in the Western intellectual tradition. Ram Mohan Roy was proficient in Arabic, Persian, Bengali, English. He was a prolific writer. So they set up schools, they set up institutions where, education is not divided on the basis of gender or class. At the level of, in religious terms also, there are major reforms taking place. You have organizations like the Ramakrishna Mission being established. Vivekananda in 1893 goes to Chicago and addresses a gathering known as the World Parliament of Religions. He addresses them as the brothers and sisters of America and tells them about the glory of from the region where he comes. Okay, so for the first time, Hinduism goes outside, establishes an identity for it. It becomes known in the Western world. You have organizations like the Arya Samaj that take place, that emerge around this time, in the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. People like Dayanand Saraswati call for a return to the Vedas. So, therefore, a new form of revival, re-engagement, reform begins taking place in the 20th century. And as we enter into the 21st century, there are successive new interpretations taking place of this entire tradition.